Fender is a hot topic right now, and just about everybody's covering it from different angles, and this video is not to pile on to what's already been said, but what I want to look at is what made Fender great in the first place, what the mentality of the company seemed to be back in the early days, versus how Fender became a company that is fighting for its legacy. So fighting for what the original company built back in the 1960s. If you're interested in that, my name is Jonathan. This is TL Toneworks, and let's get started. Today's Fender is really fighting to keep its legacy, to keep what they built originally, and really make sure that no one is violating their own trademarks, which seems to be a very different approach than what Leo Fender was doing back in the 1960s, where Leo didn't seem to be fighting to keep what he had built, but he was always pushing to innovate, improve, perfect not only the guitar that he was building, but also the system by which he was producing the guitars and the amplifiers. So there's definitely, the conduit is the name Fender and the look of the instruments and the amplifiers. But what is different is the mentality of the company and the philosophy from the original inception to where we're at today. We're going to be looking at certain things that are given as credit for Leo Fender being the original builder of certain things, but we'll also see that he may not have invented certain things, but he sure has perfected them or made them available for everybody. So I don't think it's all about having the original concept, but being able to take a concept and making it available mass market to everybody, and not just mass market, but being a great, reliable product. So let's start with the first thing. Now, a lot of people focus on originality. So the body shape should be 100% original. The headstock shape should be 100% original. Flat out copying, sure, maybe that's just somewhat wrong in certain circumstances. Maybe if the headstock shape is too much like another company, that could confuse the consumer. But it looks to me like people have made concerted effort to make their headstocks different from the big companies like Gibson and Fender. But even then, if you go and have a look at the original design of the Fender Stratocaster headstock, it looks a lot like the one from the Bixby guitars. So Bixby used to make guitars, and I don't know if they still do, but as far as I know, they focus primarily now on the Bixby bridge. But if you look at the original headstock from the Bixby and that of the Stratocaster, there's a lot of similarity. It's not a one-to-one reproduction, but it's close enough that you can say, hey, they definitely drew inspiration from that one. We could look at it as Leo Fender trying to be a little more innovative and more practical with the size of the headstock, but perfected it in his own way. Then we have to look at also perhaps like the 6 inline tuners. We can see that the Bixby also had this. How about solid body? A lot of people credit Leo Fender as being the first guy to make the solid body. We can see that the Bixby had solid bodies. It's not the same shape. The guitars look completely different, but what I think is different is that Leo Fender made it mass market, made it easier to do and quicker perhaps than what the competition was doing at the time. So that way he could get those solid body guitars out the door, into stores, and into the hands of guitar players. We also see that Leo Fender, often, like if you go on forums or Facebook group, a lot of people say Fender were the first company to invent the electric bass. We have some information that points towards the fact that in the 1930s, there was at least one Paul H. Tutmarc is credited as having been one of the first person to make the electric bass. But Fender popularized it, put it in the hands of more people. So in that sense, if we say, yeah, Fender is the first to mass produce the first electric bass and have it on TV in the hands of studio musicians and live musicians, 100% we can give him the credit. But anyone could take anything that Fender has done, and that's what I'm trying to prove here. Anyone could say Fender didn't invent anything. That's a bit of a stretch. But to say that they purely invented it, no one before them had done these things, I think the real argument is that Fender was looking around what people were doing. They were borrowing ideas, trying to perfect them and make them better and make the best version of that innovation, of that idea, and then putting it in the hands of everybody. If we look at Fender from that point, yes, they were innovators. It wasn't so much they were inventors, but they were innovating the electric guitar in the earliest stages of electric guitar. Another thing that we don't give them credit for is how easily they managed to make a system, and rapidly too, where if you had issues with the guitar neck, let's say you needed a refret, they were like, instead of having the neck built into the guitar like a set neck, how about it's just a bolt-on? Take the neck off, we'll send you another neck, put it on, there you go, fix the problem. They also were, as far as I can tell, one of the earliest to adapt to taking the whole reverb tank and integrating it into the amplifiers by the mid-60s. I don't know if they were the only ones doing it, but they adopted this by the mid-60s. So back in like the early 60s and 50s, you had an amplifier. They didn't have a reverb, so you had to buy a separate reverb tank. No one is saying that Fender invented reverb. There was another company already building reverb at the time, but Fender was at least one of the first people to implement it into the amplifier. That way you didn't need an extra piece of gear to get reverb. So bolt-on necks, reverb into the amp. And I don't know if Fender is credited with being the first to do this, but I know that they were huge on making package deals for students. So they had student guitars with student amps, and those student guitars and amps in today's market are like extremely expensive for the most part, and they're reliable, they sound great, they play great, and these were meant for students, like beginner stuff. Eventually you outgrow it and move on to something else, and you got like pro level people who are still playing those student guitars. That's a real testimony to how great Fender was at making these products. Another point that I think is important to talk about is guitar pickups. Did they invent the electric guitar pickup? As far as I can tell, no. There were pickups before. Gibson had them. Gretsch had them. I'm not sure if there's other companies. I don't know. Like, I didn't do a 2 months research on this topic. But what they did do, however, is besides having a certain look to an instrument, there was a sound associated with it. So the sound that was associated with the Telecaster is significantly different than the one associated with the Strat. The Jazzmaster doesn't sound like a Telecaster. The P bass doesn't sound like a jazz bass, so on and so forth. So yes, they weren't reinventing the pickup at the time, but they were voicing them so differently that a Strat didn't sound like a Telly, and the P bass sounded nothing like the jazz bass. And this brings me to the next point, which is that there didn't seem to be as much suing going around. Like Gibson wasn't suing Fender, and Fender wasn't suing Gretsch, so on and so forth. As far as I can tell, Leo Fender didn't bring anyone to court. The only thing that I found is that there seemed to be an issue with naming early on with the Telecaster. So Leo Fender called the Telecaster the Broadcaster previously, but Gretsch had a drum named the Broadcaster. Apparently they sent a letter to Fender, and Fender went, okay, not fighting this, we'll just change the name. So if we're to look at it, it seems like Fender was really about not just the innovation of the instrument, but also the innovation of how to produce these instruments and these amplifiers, make a top-notch product, be at the top of the game, and be at the top of the sales as well. So they were building these things, sending them out. It didn't matter if you were playing the beginner stuff or playing their professional line. It was all great quality instruments and amplifiers. While nowadays, it seems like there's been a shift, so that could be economic reasons, cultural reasons. There's all sorts of things that can make a company change its own philosophy and values over the years. Which brings us to current Fender. We're going to be looking at perhaps, I'm wondering if we should do like a pros and cons of like the pros for Fender and some of the cons for Fender, pros for us and cons for us kind of thing. And before we do that, I want to kind of set a scenario if we would change the parameters of what's going on with Fender, how we would feel and how we would respond to what they're currently doing. Let's imagine for 2 minutes that Fender was doing this right now, but they had been on the scene for 10 years. So imagine they were a fairly new company. Everything that we know from Fender, all their designs right now, were basically done in the last 10 years. No one had thought to design guitars like that before. How would we feel if that same company that was fairly new, was still small, didn't have the legacy and the iconic perception that everyone attributes to them right now in how the company is in 2026? Let's say they were much smaller and they were fighting against everybody, kind of ripping off their design, ripping off their ideas. Would we be as critical of them if they were much smaller? Now, some people would say that is a stupid way to look at it, because Fender, if they were smaller, wouldn't have the money to bully people into submission. They couldn't take everybody to court. And that's my point. That's the point I'm trying to make, is if they were in the same predicament, but were much smaller, didn't have all the resources they have now, would we still tell them that they're greedy? Would we still tell them that they're bullies? Or would we look at it like, good on them, they should stand up for what is theirs? Because the way I'm looking at it is, yes, you can look at Fender as being this giant corporation. They can have all the lawyers in the world and they can play a dirty game that nobody else can play within the confines of the law. Or you could look at it like if it was happening to your favorite small company that is building awesome guitars and everyone was ripping them off and they were fighting for what is theirs. Would you champion them, or would you tell them to sit down because they're being greedy? That is the angle that I'm considering here, because yes, when you purchase Fender, you don't have just the name Fender, you have the legacy that comes with it, you have all the trademarks that come with it. Is it wrong for them to fight for that? People are saying, well, they've tried that in the past and they lost. But that doesn't mean it's set in stone. They can still come back and fight it some more. And at some point, it just takes a judge to go, okay, I don't see a problem with you guys fighting for this. It's yours. So everybody else, go to court and fight for your design and hope that the law is not too hard on you, which is not a fun position to be in when you've been building guitars that are based on those classic Fender designs, like the Strat or the Telly. You're doing your own versions of that with some modifications, with some improvements. Which brings us now, considering that point of view, if they were small, would you be okay with them doing this, compared to now how a lot of people criticize Fender because they are titans fighting the small companies? This brings us to look at what's good for Fender, what's bad for Fender, what's good for us, and what's bad for us. And by us, I mean everybody else who's not Fender. So let's start with the cons, what I'm seeing that could be a big issue. And this is a conversation, so if there's anything you want to add in the comments to what I'm saying here, perhaps you disagree with everything I'm saying in this video, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. Just go ahead, leave your comments. As long as you remain respectful, no issues. I'm going to let those comments in the comment section. Here's what I'm seeing. So if Fender is going, anyone who's producing an instrument that looks like anything we've built, we're shutting you down. That is it. We're taking you to court. You have to destroy everything. The impact of that is you're creating limits on competition, and you're also destroying the opportunity for innovation. There's people out there building instruments and they have a very different mindset than the traditional instrument. If you're starting to impede on the possibility for them to build guitars by saying you cannot do these, eventually other companies are going to start doing the same thing perhaps. And eventually what you end up with is ugly guitars that are just trying to avoid trademark issues with some of these big companies. And we're going to end up with guitars that may not be that beautiful. The guitar has been around for a long time now, and it's quite easy to imagine that everyone's tried just about everything in terms of shape. It's really hard to get creative with the parameters of an instrument. So if you're getting inspired by a Strat or a Telly or a Gibson SG or an ES335, something along those lines, and you're being told you can no longer even get close to the look of those instruments, people are just going to get frustrated because there's going to be an open door for them to get sued by anyone. This guitar looks too much like mine, taking you to court. There's a difference between making a guitar and writing Fender on the top and selling it as a legitimate Fender product, as opposed to taking inspiration from something, trying to innovate, perfect things that this instrument, the original one, doesn't offer. We can think of Sir guitars. We can think of Anderson. I mean, there's all these brands out there who are making great instrument that resemble what Fender's doing, but they're offering option that Fender isn't even touching at this point. There's also the fact that publicly we kind of see the Strat as like your prototypical electric guitar. If you ask anyone that doesn't play guitar, what do you think of when you think electric? It's probably going to be a Strat or a Les Paul. It's been going on for so long that companies are kind of expected to have some kind of S-type guitar or a T-type guitar somewhere in their lineup, because some people might not want to buy it from Fender, but they want to have that traditional look with the modern features that, you know, ESP offers, or Schecter, or name the company. If it's become such a staple and everybody has some kind of variant on it, I remember, I'm not sure if it was Epiphone or Gibson back in the 80s that actually had like a Super Strat in their lineup. If I can find the picture, I will overlay it. I actually had one at one point. I believe it was an Epiphone. Even they went down that route. So where does it end, right? The Strat is so iconic and everybody's been able to build some kind of variant on it for so long. Now, if Fender is like, no, nothing that resembles our guitars are to be produced by anyone else but us, that can have a massive impact on the economy as we know it, especially in terms of small builders making products that are designed similarly to Fender's. Competition gets driven into the ground, but I think the biggest factor that we need to consider, the biggest con, is pissing off the customer base. Meaning you and I, if we look at Fender and this idea that they're greedy, or this idea that they are just in it to destroy the economy, and people come up with all sorts of stuff. If people start to have really bad sentiment towards the company, that kind of PR is really hard to undo. So for them going after companies, if the public is seeing it in a negative light, it might hurt them in the long run. So what they're trying to avoid, which is to lose money, might just hit them back in the back of the head at some point, because it's going to have this boomerang effect where they're just hoping that they can get as much money as they can for their own intellectual property, but then they pissed off all the people that were either supporting them or indifferent to them, and now they're going to be on camp, we're not happy with Fender. So that's definitely something for them to consider. And I'm obviously now seeing a lot of people saying, I'm boycotting them, I'm selling my stuff. I'm like, guys, calm down. This too will pass. I love my Fender, and I have a Stratocaster. I have a Squier Classic Vibe 60, and I have the little Pro Junior behind me. And no matter how I feel about it, I'm not selling my stuff. Fender is not going to care if I sell my shit or not, right? So I understand, though, why people are pissed off. It makes sense. But now let's try to look at it in a positive light. So perhaps the pros that could come out of it, both for Fender and for us as customers, for retailers, and perhaps small builders. So at the start of the video, I talked about how Leo Fender was looking around at what was basically being built by others, grabbing some of those ideas, perfecting them. He would come up with his own designs. He would improve his own designs. And before we get to that part of it, we have to remember that when Leo sold Fender, He had a little while there where he could not compete with Fender, but when he came back, he was on fire. In 1976, he was with Music Man, and he came up with the Stingray. Basically, he took the P-Bass and just made a monster out of that design. He pushed the bridge back, the 2 pickup system became 1 humbucker. He had, I believe in 76, it was an active EQ that was a 2-band EQ, so bass and treble. He had this, what was it called again? The magnetic field design, the MFD pickups. There was the bridge that he worked on, the dual fulcrum vibrato. He also had like this locking saddle thing that he did with the bridge. So basically what I'm saying is that he wasn't done perfecting. He took the basis of the P-Bass and just made it better. His own design, he built up on it, which I think was one of the things that if you look at, Fender was saying, you don't compete with us. And he was like, no. But he still managed to make amazing products, still based on his own creations. So if we're to look at it from this angle, when he started G&L, he wasn't reinventing the wheel. He was still going for the look of the guitars that he himself pioneered, but he just made them better. So lawsuits like these could lead to companies having to really think outside the box. There's so many brilliant people out there that could look at the situation saying, okay, we need to think outside the box. We need to innovate, which may push Fender into its own corner where they're more traditional, and companies now just need to step up, find new ways to work around the law that's in place. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It really depends on your optic, but I think that it gives people at least an option to look at guitar building in a different way. Perhaps these kind of limitations that are set forth by really big companies who are saying, no, you don't get to touch what we make, might push them to do something different. I mean, we've seen it with Strandberg guitars. Headless guitars had been done before. I believe it was Steinberger who had headless guitars in the 80s. But if you look at some of the headless design today, they're quite different. Some of them are headless with like a more traditional neck. Some of them have multi-scale options, fan fret. I mean, there's a bunch of different ways to build guitars. So perhaps leaving the traditional model, the S-types, the T-types, etc., and looking for new ways to build guitars. There's only so many ways you can shape an instrument, but perhaps there's a way to do it where you can't be taken to court. Maybe that's going to happen. For Fender, I understand why they're doing this. They're doing this to prevent customer confusion. So when you walk into a store, there's a bunch of guitars on that wall. Let's say 60% of them look like Fender products. Sure, the headstock is different, but the body looks like those guitars. So they're really copied by everyone else. Perhaps them doubling down on this is to try to limit that kind of space. When they go into a store and they're like, okay, you guys get to have our products there, we don't want it to be confused with these 10 other companies. I understand why they would be doing that. But then at the same time, I don't know how they are with retailers. I really can't say. But I'm thinking if I had a company and I wanted to protect my quote unquote legacy, I would try to make it so that customers aren't confused between what I built and what the competition is building. They shouldn't technically be so confusing that you bought a guitar and you think it's a Fender when it's not a Fender. Stuff like this also prevents forgeries. So you got companies where the ethics might, not companies, but countries where the ethics might not be the same as what Fender is used to. So these companies get to make downright flat out forgeries of their instrument. We've seen it with what we call the Chibsons. So guitars that are made to look like Gibsons, but they're really fabricated in China, and people sometimes get fooled, buy them at Gibson prices when they are not legit Gibsons. Doing this also reinforces the value behind their legacy. In other words, if they're really fighting for what is theirs, they're making sure that it doesn't get diluted by a bunch of copies, be it better than what they make or inferior to what they make. And it also keeps the perceived quality in the public's eye of what Fender is doing. So if you grab a guitar that looks like a Strat or a Telly, but it isn't, and it plays like garbage, you're going to start to associate these kind of guitars as being budget options, even though maybe they're not. So Fender does make guitars that are quite expensive, and they do have entry-level guitars, and their entry-level guitars and maybe what the competition is doing might not be even on the same level. That's a net positive for them, but what's the positive for us? I believe that having this discussion can open up the possibility of finding some positive in this. So if Fender can double down on what is theirs, perhaps smaller companies can do the same. There's a lot of copying going on in gear manufacturing. I talked about this in a previous episode where I was saying, when it comes to guitar pedals, for example, there's only so many circuits. So eventually people are tweaking a few values on the circuit to make it sound different or to have options that the original circuit doesn't have. But how many tube screamers do you need? How many Fender Deluxe or AC15 variants do you need? You can buy an actual Vox from Vox, or you could buy some kind of modded boutique, super like quality hand-wired version from another company who's doing their take on that circuit. People don't seem to have the ability to fight so much about circuit, so that gets sort of free pass. Same thing happens with pedals, but guitars seems to be the last bastion, if you will, where companies can actually fight for what is theirs, because otherwise it kind of becomes a free-for-all. Anyone can copy the design from other instrument, and the guitar, want it or not, is more of a visual thing to begin with. An amp, no one really pays attention, like non-musicians don't pay attention to amps, but a guitar or a bass, those things hit you like they're iconic visually speaking. That probably explains why Fender wants people to really pay attention to their product and not get confused with other companies. Something that I say often when I do these kind of videos is that I'm not a know-it-all, I'm not an expert, and me doing a video is basically just to open up a dialogue between me as a musician, what I get to see. I do have a small community here on YouTube. I can make these videos. I can talk about certain things where I try to take a different perspective on certain popular topics. But in this case, I don't have 20/20 vision. I can't speak in a way that everything I say is going to be bulletproof and no one can argue. The point is, I'm not trying to be right about what I'm seeing. I'm just trying to look at it from a different perspective so that perhaps I can see all the different point of views that are already out there. And perhaps there's a way to look at what's going on as a sign of something devastating that could be happening, or maybe a great opportunity to do different things with gear and how we build our own brands when we start to build pedals, build amplifiers, and build guitars. You let me know what you think. Do you think this could have some positive effect? Do you think it's all negative? Is there maybe an angle I haven't really talked about or any other YouTuber hasn't really considered at this point? Something that we should have focused on. It was obvious just staring at us in the face and we all kind of ignored it or didn't even look for it. So I'm opening up this dialogue. Let me know in the comments section. In the meantime, if you haven't seen my video on what I consider to be signs of the end of the golden age of guitar gear, I'm going to link that here right on screen so you can click on that video. And in the meantime, take care of yourself, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Cheers.